Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to, plunge into those parts of history that maybe don't get talked about enough, finding those truths that shift how we see things. When you picture slavery in the Americas, there's this image, right? It's almost automatic. White guys, the slave owners, total power. Black women, forced into those hitting situations. Black men in chains, out in the fields, under that harsh sun. It's a really powerful image, deeply ingrained, and absolutely a horrific part of the story. But, history is rarely that simple, is it? Often there are these deeper layers, maybe more unsettling, kind of hidden truths that the standard history books just glance over. Yeah. So today, our deep dive is going to challenge that standard picture a bit. We're looking at something less discussed, but really significant. We're exploring the role, this sometimes surprising, sometimes very dark role that some white women played in exploiting and abusing enslaved Black men. And this isn't just some small detail. It really makes you rethink how slavery worked, and honestly, it still echoes today.
That's exactly right. When you look at the historical letters, the private diaries, the testimonies that have survived, what emerges is this crucial dimension of slavery's real complexity that often gets ignored. These sources, they force us to face a past that's, much more nuanced and frankly, sometimes even more disturbing than the stories we usually hear.
Right. So for you listening, our mission today is really to pull back the curtain on this specific part of, total domination, to challenge some assumptions, maybe provide a fuller picture, even if it's a difficult one, of what slavery was really like and, crucially, its lasting impact. Because, to really understand where we are now, we kind of have to bravely look into every corner of the past, don't we?
We do.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Think about the southern plantations, say 1700s, 1800s. These weren't just farms. They were like entire worlds, these little kingdoms almost, ruled by white families. And yeah, the standard view is right in that white men were definitely at the top, politics, trade, the big economic picture. But there's another layer of power we often miss, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. What's often overlooked, and I think truly fascinating here, is the real significant power held by white women within that whole system.
Yeah.
We're talking wives, daughters, sometimes even mistresses of the plantation owner. They weren't just, passive bystanders. They held real authority, especially over the day-to-day running of things, the household for sure, but often it stretched out into the fields too.
Yeah.
Their influence touched everything in daily life for the enslaved people.
Yeah, and the accounts we've looked at, they really bring this home. There's this phrase that keeps popping up, something like, when the master was away, the mistress was the ruler. And you have to think about what that actually means. She wasn't just like managing the grocery list. She decided who got food, who did what awful job, who might get a break, and who got punished and how badly. We see records, don't we, of them deciding like who works in the blazing heat versus who gets a slightly easier task, deciding if a sick kid gets a bit extra food, or if a man gets whipped for something tiny. It was very active, direct power.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And if you connect that position of, near absolute power within its sphere, connect that to the theme we're discussing today, it becomes pretty clear how that authority inside a system built on total control could easily slide into the most private, most exploitative parts of enslaved people's lives. And the sources show a really harrowing pattern where this power was sometimes used against Black men in ways that went way beyond just work. Disturbing ways.
And this is where we get into that darker truth, the one hinted at in those records. They show that some, not all, but some white women actively coerced enslaved Black men into sexual acts. Now, it wasn't always, overt physical violence, though the threat of it, or worse, was always there, hanging over every single interaction. The coercion often had this sort of dual nature, didn't it? Based on the sources, sometimes it was promises, maybe lighter work, a bit of extra cloth, more food, some small favor that might shield them from something worse.
Yeah, perceived benefit.
Right. But just as often, maybe more often, it was through terrifying threats. The whip, obviously. The horror of being sold away from family, from everyone you know. And then there was that insidious, deadly risk of being falsely accused of rape if the man dared to say no.
The sheer devastation of that situation for these men is hard to really wrap your head around. They were completely trapped. A total no-win scenario.
Yeah.
If they submitted, they lost control over their own bodies, their dignity. They lived under this constant violation. But if they resisted, they risked literally everything, their lives included. Because one accusation from a white woman, true or not, could, as the sources say, destroy them instantly. His word meant absolutely nothing against hers. Zero.
The scales weren't just tipped, they were completely broken. No protection at all.
None.
And this abuse, even though it was happening behind the closed doors of the main house, it often seems to have been an open secret among the enslaved community. Others knew. They saw the little signs, heard the whispers, but what could they possibly do? They couldn't intervene, couldn't protect their own family members or friends. Can you imagine the psychological weight? A man forced into that situation with the mistress at night and then having to face her husband out in the fields the next morning, carrying that awful, dangerous secret.
Yeah, the silence around it must have been just deafening. A heavy cloak of terror and powerlessness constantly.
And the truly cruel irony here, that even if these acts somehow came out into the open, the whole system was built to protect one person absolutely and destroy the other. What happened when, say, a white husband found out about these relationships, as they might have been called? The records are crystal clear, aren't they?
Starkly clear. The blame never, ever fell on the wife. Never. The societal structure, the racial hierarchy, it completely shielded her. She was presumed innocent or at least not culpable in the same way. But the consequences for the black man, utterly brutal, completely unjust. He'd be labeled a beast, dehumanized immediately. Then subjected to horrific torture, maybe sold off instantly, separated forever from his family, or horrifyingly often just lynched on the spot. It just throws into sharp relief the massive power imbalance and how the system protected white women, even when they were the aggressors in these situations. It was all about upholding white supremacy and this idea of protecting white womanhood no matter the cost, especially if the cost was a black man's life.
It really hammers home the total lack of justice. No recourse, no legal pathway, nothing.
Nothing at all.
Just immediate, savage punishment. His life was disposable. Hers was protected. End of story, regardless of the max. And the impact, the trauma of all this, it didn't just stop with the individuals involved. It rippled outwards, didn't it? These forced situations left deep generational scars on families, on whole communities for decades afterwards. The sources talk about how generations carried these scars. You hear about stories whispered down through families about grandfathers forced into fathering children for their mistress's pleasure or for profit. Just imagine carrying that kind of knowledge, that kind of secret betrayal passed down quietly, something you could never really talk about openly.
And we can't ignore the profit aspect you mentioned. That adds another layer of horror. It raises a really important question. Why did this happen? Why was it tolerated, even implicitly? Well, partly because every child born to an enslaved woman meant more wealth for the slave owner. Full stop. So whether it was forced reproduction organized by the owner or these coercive acts by mistresses that sometimes resulted in children, the underlying driver often came back to increasing the owner's human capital. It was this cruel mix of economic calculation and profound personal violation. The enslaved body was just seen as a tool, a commodity.
It's so important to get that this story doesn't just end when slavery is officially abolished in 1865. The shadows of this power dynamic, they stretched long after that, really shaping things in the post-slavery South, especially during the Jim Crow era. The actual chains might have been gone, but those psychological chains, those societal controls, they were still incredibly strong.
Oh, absolutely. White women who used to have that direct physical control over enslaved men, they found new ways to exert influence in the decades after the Civil War. Now, their power often flowed through things like controlling jobs, access to wages, shaping someone's reputation through rumors. The whole oppressive social structure was still there. The dynamic shifted, yeah, but the potential for abuse and the danger for black men remained incredibly high.
And that influence became a really potent weapon. A single whisper, something seemingly small like, he looked at me wrong, or he got too close. That could be enough to ruin a man's life in the Jim Crow South instantly.
Yeah.
It was this quick, quiet, devastating form of control, and it often led to immediate, violent backlash from white men in the community who felt they had to protect white womanhood.
And this pattern connects directly to that larger, incredibly damaging societal myth. The myth of the black man is this inherent sexual threat to white women. That myth, which had roots right back in the slavery narratives we've been talking about, it was just passed down, reinforced, and weaponized again and again for generations. And it led to countless lynchings. Emmett Till's murder in 1955 is maybe the most infamous example, but just one of so many. His supposed crime, maybe a whistle. The result, unspeakable violence, death, all fueled by that weaponized myth.
We should also remember, though, that people fought back against this injustice. Figures like Ida B. Wells, amazing journalist, activist, she tried to expose these lies. She gathered evidence, showed how often these accusations were just fabricated, total excuses to terrorize black communities and keep them down, maintain control. She risked her own life doing it.
Absolutely heroic work. And yet, despite those efforts, the truth largely stayed buried, didn't it? Because, As the source would suggest, polite Southern society preferred the myth. They preferred the simpler story. White women are always victims, never aggressors. Even though the reality, as we're seeing, is way more complex. Yes, some white women suffered under patriarchy, no question. But others actively used their race, their gender, their protected status to exploit men who had absolutely no power to refuse. And society just looked the other way, conspired to keep it quiet.
Okay, so let's bring this up to today, because this hidden history, it's still coming out, isn't it? Things like DNA tests, old diaries being rediscovered, family stories finally being told. They continue to reveal this hidden history. Stuff that was buried deep is coming to light. And these aren't just, interesting historical facts. They're deeply personal for people living now.
Oh, profoundly personal. You have descendants today who, through a DNA test or finding an old letter, suddenly discover white ancestors in their bloodlines. Ancestors born from these secrets that were never spoken aloud for generations. Imagine the impact of that. It forces this huge reckoning with family history, revealing how much more complicated and painful and interconnected everything is than people thought. It can shatter the narratives families have told themselves for years.
It really makes you stop and think why this part of history is rarely taught, doesn't it? We see movies, documentaries. They show the overseer's whip, the auction block, the chains, the public horrors of slavery, and they absolutely should. But what happened behind closed doors, in bedrooms and candlelit chambers? What happened in those private hidden spaces on the plantation that often gets left in silence? Why? Why do we collectively find it so hard to look at the specific truth?
And yet, ignoring it means we're ignoring the full reality of slavery. We're leaving out a critical piece of the puzzle, a piece that helps explain the systemic nature of the oppression and why its consequences have lasted so long. It's not just some uncomfortable side note. It's fundamental to understanding what total human domination actually looked like and how power, in every form, was used and abused.
Which brings us right back to the core understanding from this whole deep dive, really. Slavery was not only about labor, it was so much bigger, so much deeper than that. It was about total domination, body, mind, future. Every single part of an enslaved person's life was under someone else's control, open to manipulation, and often brutal violation. So, okay, what does this all mean for us now? How do we connect these historical threads to today?
Well, I think facing this particular truth, it doesn't mean blaming every single white woman from history or excusing the undeniable central role of white men in upholding the entire system. That's not the point. What it does mean is seeing really clearly how power, especially absolute unchecked power within a rigid hierarchy like slavery, corrupts whoever holds it, regardless of gender. It shows the devastating ways that privilege, both racial and gender privilege, could be weaponized within that cruel system. It impacted everyone, though obviously not equally at all.
And crucially, I think it helps us understand why, even now, today, these deeply ingrained stereotypes about Black men and white women can still fuel so much fear, mistrust, and sometimes actual violence in our society.
Yeah.
These historical legacies aren't just abstract ideas from the past. They're kind of the bedrock for many of our current social tensions, our racial biases, even inequalities in the justice system. Understanding this hidden history helps us see those roots and maybe start to dismantle the myths that linger.
Mm-hmm. Precisely.
So as we wrap up what's been, frankly, a challenging but really necessary deep dive, let's just hold on to that central message for you, listening. It's only by telling the whole story without trying to make it comfortable, without hiding parts away, facing all the difficult truth, that the real healing can even begin.
Yeah. And this isn't just, folklore or exaggerated stories. This is fact drawn from the historical record. To really grasp the immense cost of freedom, the sacrifices involved, and why the fight for justice continues, we absolutely have to uncover every single hidden truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. Maybe think about how these silences from the past still echo in our conversations today, how they shape what we think we know. There's always more to learn, isn't there, about the complexities of our shared history and how much is still living within us now.